Hi there, welcome to the iStill Distillery, or actually to the iStill University. My name is Odin, and the reason I want to talk to you today is simply because we won't meet each other in Portland. We won't meet each other in New Orleans because the shows have been cancelled, and we thought, how do we reach out to you? How do we connect? And then when we thought a bit further, we actually realized that it's maybe not just us that you want to visit, that you want to see at a trade show. You go there, you come there because you actually want to learn about distilling. So what we're going to do today is open up a bit of that vast knowledge that we have as the iStill University in such a way that we're going to educate you. We're going to talk to you about various topics that are important if you want to open up a distillery. And that's what we're going to do today. The first topic I want to talk to you about is yeast. Yeast is essential if you want to make spirits. It does a lot of good things in the alcohol production. I want to talk a little bit about the history of yeast, where does it come from, about its metabolism, how does it create energy to do what it needs to do, which is make alcohol for us. And I want to dive into a model that shows you what kind of yeast and what kind of yeast management allows you to create certain flavors in your whiskey, in your brandy, or in your rum. And at the end of this video, I want to talk about the various families of yeast that are available for you to use or purchase and to make your drinks from. What are the benefits of the one kind versus another one? Let's start with the history of yeast. Yeast is a microorganism. First we had bacteria that could survive in environments without oxygen. And then yeast came along some 500 million years ago. And yeast is the first organism to take advantage of the ever richer oxygen levels on planet Earth some 500 million years ago. So yeast is very peculiar. It has actually two metabolisms. If there's oxygen present, it will use the oxygen to burn, to create energy, just like you and I, create a lot of energy, create a lot of new yeast cells from it. And if the oxygen levels in its environment are depleted, something else happens. It switches to a secondary metabolism. Can't procreate anymore. There's not a lot of energy without oxygen. But it does make alcohol for us. If we add yeast to the grape juice or to the mash, at first there's oxygen in there. So what the yeast will do is multiply. It won't make alcohol because it only makes alcohol when the oxygen in the mash is depleted. Now some say that actually that's not a good thing because we want the yeast to actually help create alcohol. We don't want it to actually make more yeast cells. But there's a good thing to having the yeast actually grow, because that means that you now create in your fermentation an abundance of yeast cells, some very young, some very old, and together they create more interesting flavors for you. So you need an inoculation period where actually the yeast gets into the liquids, uses up the oxygen, and then moves to the secondary kind of energy system that it has and starts to make alcohol for us. But how do we pitch yeast? There's a lot of science around it, a lot of pseudoscience I might say, of how you start up a fermentation. And it very often involves a little bit of yeast, flasks, sugar, water, to make sure that you grow a yeast population maybe over the course of days, 2 days, 3 days, and then you add it to your mash and you start fermenting. I don't like that because it's a labor-full kind of work. It's a lot of work to actually do that. I think it is much better to just take granulated yeast, measure how much you need, depending on the size of your ferment, and from that moment onwards, simply sprinkle it on top. Now, sprinkling yeast on top of your mash doesn't sound very sexy, but it is very easy. And we did a lot of tests. What works better? A yeast starter, mixing in the yeast, or basically sprinkling the yeast on top. And it's the third way that works best. And the reason is you can measure exactly how much yeast you add, but also by sprinkling it on top of your container, on top of your mash, the yeast slowly gets wet and slowly gets reintroduced to liquids. Instead of forcing it in, which creates a lot of yeast cell mortality, sprinkling yeast on top is easy and it works the best. One of the questions we get is, should we use dry yeast versus wet yeast. And my advice is always make life simple on yourself. There's not going to be any difference in terms of flavor, but granulated yeast is dry. It's easy to work with. It doesn't stick to your hands. You don't need to cut it. You don't need to really take care of it. You can just put it in the fridge. And you can measure it. You can measure how much you need. And in order to know how much you need, there's a very simple rule. If you make X amount of fermentation, you need X amount of yeast through this formula. For every liter of fermentation capacity that you have, for every liter of beer or wine that you're intending to make, you need 0.7 grams of yeast. So if you have a 1,000-liter fermenter and you want to make 1,000 liter of distiller's beer, maybe to process into a vodka or into a whiskey, you basically need 1,000 times 0.7 is 700 grams of dry and granulated yeast. You measure it off, you sprinkle it on top of your ferment, you close it off, the yeast will sink in slowly without a lot of yeast mortality. It will procreate because there's some oxygen left in your mash, and after a few hours it will start to make amazing flavors as well as the alcohol you're after. So we talked about yeast and that it has two metabolisms. We talked about just pitching yeast by sprinkling it on top. And we discussed how much you actually need. Let's dive into the really important question. And it is a question that you can read a lot about, that you can visit workshops for, and I just want to nail it down for you. How does the yeast that I choose influence the flavor of the spirit I'm trying to make? That's a really important question, right? Because we all know that if we make beer, as a consumer's beer, the choice for the yeast is very, very important to create certain flavors that you want to have in your beer. Now, if you want to take that beer and distill it into a whiskey, it better has the flavors that we are actually looking for. The problem with this topic is that there's a lot of, let's just say, there's a lot of bullshit out there. There's a lot of really bad information. And unfortunately, that information comes from people that don't really understand yeast, or even worse, that actually do understand yeast and make a living out of it by selling it to you. They'll sell you stories. They'll say, this is an amazing yeast because it makes rum really taste very well. Or they'll say, okay, so you want to make a very complex whiskey. Now that's the kind of yeast you need to buy. We happen to make it for you. It's like 10 times more expensive than, let's say, normal baker's yeast, but you want to make an amazing whiskey? You need an amazing yeast. Then they start to talk about how fruity the flavors are, or how nice and multidimensional the flavors are, or how good the yeast is at actually consuming all the sugars and turning it into, very effectively so, a lot of alcohol. But there's a layer underneath, and that's a layer I want to talk to you about today. The layer underneath that is that yeast is a simple organism that lives in an environment, and if we create certain hostilities or a cozy place in that environment, what happens is that that yeast is going to be happier or less happy. It's going to be in a situation where it feels it can do its job perfectly well, or it gets stressed out. And all those stories about different strains of yeast making different flavors boil down to a very simple scheme, which I'm going to draw for you right now. Your fermentation isn't just about water and grain and yeast. It's about two more things. It's about temperature management, and it's about the management of pH, sourness. And any yeast strain, let's take distiller's yeast, quite neutral, has the ability to work in a slightly warm environment or a slightly colder environment, and has the ability to work in a slightly more sour environment or in a more base, a sweeter environment. The question about flavor composition and yeast has to do by how far we push the yeast out of its comfort zone. Let's say this is a neutral yeast, that's why it's sitting in the middle. And let's say we actually ferment at very high temperatures, 30 degrees Celsius and more. We push the yeast outside of its comfort zone. It starts to create other flavors. What would happen if we would introduce the yeast to a beer fermentation that is actually very sour? Maybe 3.0, maybe 3.5. We push the yeast outside of the threshold where it normally likes to live and work. As a result, it creates different flavors. So it's not the yeast that makes certain flavors. It is a certain yeast that makes certain flavors based on the temperature it's comfortable at and the sourness level that you actually do your fermentation at. Now this is important. How does temperature and how does sourness actually affect flavor composition? Quite easy. The higher the fermentation temperature relative to the yeast you use, the more fruity flavors you get. You will also get a slightly bigger heads contamination. But it's where heads mingle with hearts where you actually find fruity flavors, front of mouth. So if you want to make a fruit brandy, probably go for a slightly higher temperature of fermentation, even when you use a distiller's yeast. By pushing it outside of its comfort zone, we actually create more fruity flavors. Sourness actually works on the third dimension, back of the throat dimension, the rootiness, the earthiness that you find in so many, let's say, Jamaican rums or Scottish whiskies. The reason that sourness is created is because we introduce the yeast to an environment that's almost hostile to it. It is so sour that as a byproduct, it starts to make flavors, ester molecules, that give it that third dimensional, rooty, earthy flavor. So to summarize, the yeast strain in itself doesn't create certain flavor profiles for you. It is the selection of a certain yeast and then pushing it into certain directions because you want to manage your fermentation temperature and your fermentation sourness level, and by doing so you create a very wide spectrum of flavors. If we go for this position, we create a very fruity rum or whiskey, but also a very rooty, nutty and earthy rum or whiskey. What if we were making a brandy? With brandy you want the fruitiness, you don't want the rootiness. So probably what you do in your management of your fermentation is you swing back. You may want to have the high temperature because the high temperature actually helps create more fruity flavors, which is totally logical if you want to make a fruit brandy. If you don't want the rooty and earthiness, make sure you manage your pH. Let it be at around 5.2 instead of 3.5. Making amazing spirits and looking at the role of yeast is not about selecting the right yeast strain. It is about choosing a yeast strain and then manipulating its environment in such a way that you create your flavor profile. This would be amazing for rum, this would be amazing for whiskey. Less sour, less three-dimensional, more fruity flavors, go form a warm fermentation only. Now stay with me, thought experiment. What would you do if you were to make a vodka in this scenario? How would you ferment your beer in order to make a great vodka? It's quite easy. Vodka is relatively neutral, so you need less flavor. So what you basically do is you make sure that your pH is 5.2, 5.5, very close to neutral. We don't create those third-dimensional, earthy, rooty flavors. You make sure your temperature is under control, maybe 25, 26 degrees. For sure not 30 degrees, because at 30 degrees, most yeasts create a lot of fruity flavors, which you don't want in a neutral product like vodka. Now that's the way I want you to look at yeast and yeast management. It's not about the strain. It's about how you manage your fermentation in terms of temperature and in terms of pH. So we discussed how yeast has an influence on flavor, basically by your management of fermentation temperature and fermentation acidity. Does yeast as a strain or the package that you want to buy, or maybe another variety that somebody advises you to purchase, does it have no influence at all? Yes, it does. Because we started with distiller's yeast, right? But what if we add baker's yeast instead? Baker's yeast is used to make bread. Bread goes into the oven where it still needs to do a little bit of work, so baker's yeast is very resistant to high temperatures. So let's say we take another color and we plot on this chart baker's yeast. Baker's yeast is happy at higher temperatures. That means that if we choose distiller's yeast or baker's yeast and we ferment both at around 30 degrees Celsius, because we stress out relatively the distiller's yeast more, it will make more fruity flavors. For baker's yeast to actually create more fruity flavors, we need to stress it more. So we need to bring up the temperature of fermentation, maybe to 32 degrees, 33 degrees, to get the same level of stress, resulting in the same level of fruitification. Another example, I'll take another color here, is about a customer that we had that had a brewery. So they made beer and now they wanted to make whiskey as well. And the beer they made, and the beer they still make, is a lager. And a lager, I'm not a beer guy, but I'll try to sort of summarize what I learned from it. A lager is a beer that ferments at a very low cellar-like temperature. So a lager yeast, by definition, is very temperature intolerant. It doesn't like warm temperatures. So he made an amazing lager. And then he scooped off that yeast and he used that to also make his distiller's beer, and then we tried to make vodka out of it. But because he was fermenting at 30 degrees, imagine the heat stress that this lager yeast, that actually normally works at cellar temperatures like 10-15 degrees Celsius instead of 25-30, how much stressed out it was. So the vodka and the whiskey that we were making or trying to make afterwards was too fruity. There was too much flavor at the beginning, a lot of heads also. So losses at the beginning of your run and flavors that aren't very good for actually a vodka or a whiskey. Would have been an amazing fruit brandy, but then again, it was a brewer and we used beer. We didn't use wine or anything like that. So yeast strain choice still is very important. But it is important because every strain has a different variability, has a different comfort zone related to both the sourness of your fermentation and the temperature of your fermentation. So if somebody tries to sell you a yeast that is really fruity in flavor, probably means that there's a lot of lager yeast in there because it's not very temperature tolerant. So if you ferment at normal temperatures, it will relatively create a lot of fruity flavors. With this in mind, you can select the optimal yeast for you. Not because somebody tells you this is the thing you should buy and this is best for rum or this is best for whiskey, but because you know how much you can control your fermentation and adapt your yeast to it. So we talked about how you really need to manage your fermentation in order to create certain flavor profiles. We also dived into how certain varieties, certain families of yeast have less tolerance for temperature or less tolerance for acidity, and by definition, in a slightly warm or slightly sour environment, create a lot of the flavors that are associated with fruitiness at the beginning and rooty and earthy flavors at the back. So if somebody tells you should ferment your whiskey at 26 degrees Celsius, really, should he? Well, not sure, right? Because I like to ferment my whiskeys at around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. Most people say, oh, that's way too high, you get a lot of fruity flavors in there. Yeah, if you choose the wrong yeast. Yeah, but I chose distiller's yeast, and as a starting distiller, it makes perfectly sense to buy distiller's yeast because I'm not a brewer, I'm a distiller, so I need distiller's yeast. Yeah, but what if you would have chosen baker's yeast instead? Higher tolerance. You can go for faster ferments. You can create more fruity flavors, or you can create less fruity flavors, basically by managing your temperature in your fermentation. I love to work with baker's yeast. There's not a lot of money to be made in baker's yeast, so most people won't sell you baker's yeast, or if they do, they call it sugar optimization yeast, whiskey optimization yeast, the best rum yeast in the world. Please remember that baker's yeast is actually developed to work with grains together. And it is grown on molasses before it's harvested and sold to you. So baker's yeast works pretty darn well with grains and with molasses. So for almost all taste-rich products that you're going to make, the cheap option of baker's yeast is not a bad choice at all. Some will tell you you need beer yeast, because if the beer tastes amazing, by definition, the whiskey or vodka should taste amazing. It's not true. Totally not true. I would almost say and argue against that. Because a whiskey as a flavor-rich product, a rum as a flavor-rich product, doesn't need to be neutral. It needs to be stressed out to actually create an interesting front-of-mouth feeling based on fruity flavors. A long-lasting finish based on those rooty, nutty, earthy flavors that come from stressing the yeast out towards a very sour environment. If you use the perfect beer as a beer maker, consumer's beer, to make whiskey, I can tell you it will become only one-dimensional. If you stress out your yeast, you actually create a beginning and an end. It's not just about the hearts flavors, a little bit of heads mixing in and a little bit of tails mixing in. You get a three-dimensional whiskey, which is, I think, exactly what you want. You're a craft distiller. You're not going to outcompete Jack Daniel's on efficiency or on scale or on marketing budget. The only road open to you if you want to become successful is to be able to make a whiskey that is more flavorsome than Jack Daniel's. Flavors are created by stressing the yeast, not by choosing a yeast, by stressing it, pH-wise, temperature-wise. Distiller's yeast is pretty neutral. You can go anywhere with it. Baker's yeast is more affordable. You can push your temperatures higher, go faster in your fermentation, make more product in the same time without losing flavors. Lager yeast is not a very good idea. For a brandy, try some wine yeasts. There are a lot of wine yeasts out there, and they're very good at making wine and pretty good for most brandies. There's other yeasts as well. For instance, champagne yeast. Champagne yeast is very, very strong. It doesn't mind if it's in a sour environment. It doesn't mind high temperatures. So basically, as a yeast, it sits somewhere over here. That also means that it is not very well suited to make a flavorful drink like rum or whiskey. Because quite simply, how do you stress this yeast out that is so strong and really isn't influenced by the highest temperatures or the most sour environments that you throw at it? This yeast will basically make one-dimensional products, which is why a champagne yeast is perfect for vodka. Because at vodka, you don't want that beginning, you don't want that flavor at the back, you want relative neutrality. I don't want additional flavors in my fermentation, so I don't get additional flavors in my distillation. In that case, champagne yeast. So we talked about baker's yeast, we talked about distiller's yeast, we spoke about beer yeast and lager yeasts. I think there's one left, and that is basically turbo yeast. It's frowned upon, and I think correctly so, because what turbo yeast really is, champagne yeast. Added to that, pH stabilizers and nutrients. So basically a turbo yeast is only champagne yeast, again, with nutrients for the yeast and with a pH stabilizer. It's basically a package you buy in order to make a very neutral product. The problem is it only works with water and sugar. It doesn't work with grains, doesn't work with wines. If there's any organics other than sugar in the water, the whole combination gets stressed out, and instead of getting less flavor like you want for your vodka, you get off flavors. So I would say turbo yeast, no go as a professional distiller. If you want to go neutral, go champagne yeast. If you want to go taste rich, grains or molasses, so whiskey or rum, go for baker's yeast. And if you want to make a fruit brandy, if you really want to make a fruit brandy, because it is only a very small market, you want a drier result, go for a dry wine yeast or go for a Chardonnay. Look at the wines you like and try to work with that yeast. And that's how easy it is to do your yeast management in a professional and correct way. Thank you.